August 6th, 1945, 8:15 a.m. One flash changed everything. Survivors described a moment that felt frozen in time. What they saw defied belief. The sky turned white, buildings vanished instantly, and then silence fell over an entire city. But what they said in those first moments reveals something historians still struggle to understand. Their words weren't what you'd expect, and one survivor's statement changed how the world saw that day forever. What they witnessed first wasn't the explosion. August 6th, 1945. A normal Tuesday morning in Hiroshima, Japan. People woke up early. They ate breakfast with their families. Workers headed to offices. Children prepared for school. The sun rose over the city like any other day. But this wasn't any other day. At 8:15 a.m., everything changed. One moment altered history forever. And the survivors who lived through it, they remembered details most people never heard about. What they saw first wasn't the explosion. It wasn't the destruction. It wasn't even the fire that came later. The first thing they noticed was light. A flash so bright it seemed impossible, brighter than anything they'd ever seen. Some thought the sun had fallen from the sky. But here's what's strange. After that flash, there was something else. Something survivors struggled to explain for years. Complete silence. The silence lasted only 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds felt like forever. Survivors described it as unnatural, wrong, like the world itself had stopped working. Birds froze in mid-flight, conversations cut off mid-sentence. Even the wind seemed to pause. One survivor, Akiko Takakura, was 20 years old that morning. She was inside a bank building. Suddenly everything went white, pure white. She couldn't see her own hands in front of her face. Then, nothing. No sound, no movement, just empty silence filling the space around her. She thought she'd gone blind and deaf at the same time, but she hadn't. Her body was fine. It was the world outside that had changed. Then the shock wave hit. Windows shattered inward like frozen rain. Walls bent and twisted. The building groaned under pressure it was never built to handle. And that's when people started screaming. But most people didn't scream right away. They were too confused to react. Another survivor, Yoshitaka Kawamoto, was 13 years old. He was outside when the flash came. He remembered looking up at the sky and seeing something strange. The clouds were gone. All of them. Vanished in an instant. The sky turned completely white, then shifted to strange colors, purple, orange, colors that shouldn't exist together. He blinked, and suddenly he was on the ground. He didn't remember falling, didn't feel any pain yet, just confusion. When he stood up, his city looked different. Buildings he'd known his whole life weren't there anymore. Streets had disappeared. Everything looked flat, like someone had erased the world around him. He turned to ask his friend what happened, but his friend was gone too. Just gone. That's when the fear started to set in. The blast came from above. A single device dropped from a plane called Enola Gay. But survivors didn't know that yet. They had no idea what had just happened to them. Some thought it was an earthquake. Others believed a massive strike had hit nearby. Nobody guessed the truth. One survivor, Sanao Suboy was 20 years old and riding his bicycle. The flash knocked him off and sent him flying through the air. When he landed, his skin felt wrong. He looked down at his arms. The skin was hanging off like loose fabric, but it didn't hurt yet. Shock protected him from the pain. He tried to stand. His legs worked. He started walking, not knowing where to go. Around him, other people did the same thing. They walked slowly, almost calmly, arms stretched out in front of them, skin hanging down, moving like shadows through the smoke. They looked almost ghostly. The fires started about 30 minutes later. Small at first, then they grew and grew. Survivor Setsuko Thurlow was 13 years old. She was trapped under a collapsed building. Wooden beams pinned her legs down. Darkness surrounded her completely. She heard crackling sounds, then smelled smoke. Fire was coming. She could feel heat getting closer. She pulled at her legs desperately, trying to free herself. "I'm going to die here," she thought. But then she heard voices. 3 classmates found her in the darkness. They pulled at the beams, pushed, pulled harder. Finally, her legs came free. They dragged her outside, and she saw her city for the first time since the flash. Nothing looked familiar anymore. The buildings were gone. The streets were unrecognizable. Everything had turned into rubble and dust. Smoke rose from 1,000 different fires. And people were everywhere, walking, stumbling, calling out for help.
The people looked like something from a nightmare. But this was real. Terrifyingly real. Their clothes had burned off their bodies. Their hair stood straight up, singed and smoking. Their faces were swollen beyond recognition. Many walked with their arms stretched forward. Why? Because their skin was peeling off, hanging down from their fingertips like gloves. Holding their arms up kept it from dragging on the ground. One survivor described them as looking like walking ghosts. They moved slowly, silently. Many were in shock, unable to speak, unable to cry, just walking, looking for help that wasn't coming. Setsuko watched them pass by. She wanted to help, but she could barely move herself. Her classmates helped her walk toward safety. Behind them, the fires grew larger. The heat became unbearable. Smoke filled the air. Breathing became difficult. And then they heard something worse than screams. They heard people calling for water. "Mizu, Mizu, water, water!" Thousands of voices begging for water. The heat had left people desperately thirsty. Burns covered their bodies. Their throats felt like fire. Many survivors tried to help. They brought water from wells, from broken pipes, from anywhere they could find it, but there was a problem nobody expected. People who drank the water died shortly after. Their bodies were too damaged, too weak. The water was sometimes contaminated. Medical help was nowhere to be found. Survivor Emiko Okada remembered giving water to a young boy. He thanked her, took a few sips, then closed his eyes and never opened them again. She carried that memory for the rest of her life, the guilt of it, even though she was just trying to help, even though she couldn't have known. But the worst part was still coming. The radiation was invisible. Nobody knew it was there. Nobody understood what it would do. In the hours after the blast, people felt okay. Survivors who weren't burned thought they'd gotten lucky. They'd made it through the worst. But they were wrong. Days later, strange symptoms appeared. People who seemed fine started getting sick. Their hair fell out in clumps. Their gums bled. Purple spots appeared on their skin. Doctors didn't understand what was happening. They'd never seen anything like this before. No medicine worked, no treatment helped. People who had walked away from the blast started passing away in hospital beds. One survivor, Dr. Michihiko Hachiya, kept a diary. He wrote about watching healthy people suddenly decline, about the confusion, the fear, the helplessness of not knowing how to help them. He called it Disease X. By August 15th, 9 days later, people learned the truth. Japan surrendered. The war was over. And that's when survivors discovered what had really happened to them. They learned about the superweapon, about the new technology, about radiation that would affect them for decades to come. For many survivors, this knowledge changed everything. They realized they'd witnessed something unprecedented in human history, something that should never happen again. But the physical effects were only part of the story. The emotional impact lasted even longer. Survivors dealt with guilt. Why did they live when so many others didn't? Why were they spared? This guilt had a name in Japanese. Ikite ite sumimasen. It means, I'm sorry I survived. Many survivors felt this deeply. They apologized for being alive. Survivor Shigeko Sasamori was 13 years old during the event. She later said the hardest part wasn't the physical scars. It was living with the memories that never faded. The city slowly rebuilt itself. But the survivors, they carried Hiroshima with them forever. Many chose to speak publicly about their experiences. They became known as hibakusha, explosion-affected people. These survivors faced discrimination in their own country. People feared being near them, feared the radiation might spread. Employers wouldn't hire them. Potential marriage partners avoided them. They were victims twice over. First from the blast itself, then from society's reaction to them afterwards. But many hibakusha refused to stay silent. They traveled the world, shared their stories, showed their scars, not for sympathy, but for education. They wanted people to understand what happened. Setsuko Turlo spoke at the United Nations. She testified before world leaders. She dedicated her life to making sure future generations understood the reality of that day. Her message was simple but powerful. This must never happen again. The numbers tell part of the story. Roughly 140,000 people lost their lives by the end of 1945. But numbers can't capture everything. They can't describe the moment a mother lost her child, or when someone called out for help that never came. Survivor Shinhei Mikamo was 5 years old during the event. He remembered searching for his father in the ruins, calling his name over and over, walking through streets filled with smoke and dust. He found his father 3 days later, barely alive, badly injured. His father recognized him, smiled weakly, and passed away hours later. Shinji later said that smile haunted him. His father used his last energy to comfort his son, to show him everything would be okay, even though it wouldn't be. These personal stories reveal what statistics cannot: the individual moments of loss, the specific memories that shaped each survivor's life afterwards. And there were thousands of these stories.
Some survivors discovered strength they didn't know they had, like Sunao Tsuboi, who we mentioned earlier. His injuries were severe. Burns covered over 90% of his body. Doctors said he wouldn't survive, but he did, against all odds. He spent over a year in the hospital, underwent countless procedures, endured unimaginable pain. But he recovered, and then dedicated his entire life to peace activism. He met with world leaders, spoke at schools, shared his experience with anyone who would listen. In 2010, he even shook hands with President Obama, the representative of the country that had dropped the device. It was a powerful moment of reconciliation. Sunao didn't seek revenge. He sought understanding. He wanted people to know the human cost, the real consequences, not abstract numbers, but actual human beings with families and dreams. He continued this work until he passed away in 2021. Today, Hiroshima stands as a modern, thriving city. Over 1.2 million people live there now. But the city hasn't forgotten. The Peace Memorial Park sits at the spot where the blast occurred. Thousands visit every year. One building still stands from that day, the Atomic Dome. Its skeleton remains as a permanent reminder: twisted metal, exposed bricks, frozen in time. Japan chose not to rebuild it. Instead, it serves as a monument, a warning, a symbol of what happened and what should never happen again. Every August 6th at exactly 8:15 a.m., a ceremony takes place. A bell rings. People observe silence. Names are read aloud. The list grows shorter each year as survivors pass away. Soon, there will be no survivors left. No first-hand witnesses to tell the story. Only their recorded testimonies will remain. That's why their words matter so much now. So what did survivors say? When they saw their city turn to silence, many said they'd felt like they'd witnessed the end of the world. Akiko Takakura, who we mentioned earlier, said this: "I thought I was the only person left alive on Earth." That feeling of complete isolation, of total destruction, stayed with survivors forever. Yoshitaka Kawamoto described it differently. He said it felt like time had stopped, like he was stuck in a moment that wouldn't end. And Setsuko Thurlow, who dedicated her life to peace activism, put it most powerfully: "We saw hell, and we survived to warn the world." These weren't dramatic exaggerations. They were simple truths, descriptions of something beyond normal human experience, something that changed them at a fundamental level. Their words carry weight because they lived through the impossible. They saw their entire world vanish in seconds. And they chose to speak, so we would listen. The legacy of Hiroshima survivors continues today. Their testimonies have been recorded, archived, translated into dozens of languages. Organizations around the world preserve these stories. Museums display their belongings. Schools teach their experiences. But perhaps their greatest legacy is this: they transformed personal tragedy into a universal message. They took unimaginable suffering and turned it into hope for a different future. They didn't seek vengeance. They sought peace. They didn't hide their scars. They showed them to the world as evidence, as proof, as warning. Today, Hiroshima represents both destruction and renewal. It shows how humanity can rebuild after devastating loss, but it also reminds us of what we're capable of destroying. The survivors wanted us to remember both lessons: the capacity for destruction and the strength to choose peace instead. Their voices echo still, and their message remains urgent. The testimonies of Hiroshima survivors teach us something powerful. These eyewitness accounts from hibakusha aren't just historical records. They're peaceful messages from people who experienced the unimaginable. Their reflections remind us why this should never happen again. If these survivor stories moved you, share this video. Help preserve their message. Their voices matter now, more than ever. Subscribe for more untold history that shaped our world.